everyone was. I played this game on easy mode. The Legend of Heroes, Trails in the Sky, SC. Well, it's on the thumbnail, so I don't know why I said the game's name out loud like that. Where do I even begin? It had everything I liked about FC and then some. The game was released in 2006 for the PC and it got a PSP version the following year. However, once again, this was for Japan only. Neither version of the game made it to the West until 2015. Yo, imagine playing Sky FC when it got localized in 2011, right? You see that ending, and then you still gotta wait 4 years for SC to come out in your language. That would've killed me. It was hard enough going through FC again just to gather video footage and refresh my memory on the story, and that only took me a couple of weeks. Just like with the first game, this one also did get an HD release on the PS3, as well as an Evolution remake for the Vita a couple of years later. These are also Japan only though, and just like with FC, you can get SC off of Steam or GOG, or you can go look for the PSP or Vita versions. Also, I'm just going to start calling them first chapter and second chapter respectively, since FC and SC sound pretty similar coming out of my mouth, and I don't want people to mistake one for the other. Now, before I get into the setting, I am going to have to spoil the cliffhanger part of first chapter, so spoiler warning. I'm going to try and keep the heavy spoilers for second chapter specifically to a minimum until I actually start talking about the story for that game, but moving forward, I'm going to assume you either know about that final part of the first chapter or you don't mind it being revealed to you. So if you're concerned about all that, just skip over to when I start talking about the gameplay, or you can do yourself a favor and go play the games. No, seriously, if you're here and you haven't played them, I'm assuming you're at least considering it. Go. Do it. Just do it. I can't speak for the later games because I haven't played them yet, but these two, they're pretty good. Believe me, that's just my opinion speaking. This video is not sponsored by Falcom in any way. What was I talking about again? The setting! Oh, yeah, the setting. So, as I said, SC stands for second chapter, and true to its name, SC is quite literally the second half of F... Oh dear God. I knew this was gonna happen. Look, all you need to know is that this game is basically Trails in, though we couldn't fit the rest of the story into the first game, so we're putting it in its own game, Sky. There. So just as a little refresher, Alba was behind all the shenanigans that went on during the first game, including the coup d'etat that y'all just cleaned up. His real name was Weissman, and he's working for an organization called Ouroboros. Joshua was basically a high-ranking assassin working under them, and up until now his memory had been wiped, so he only vaguely remembered his time there. Joshua kissed Estelle, put her to sleep, and then ran off to go deal with Ouroboros on his own. So second chapter takes place just a few hours after that. Estelle wakes up in the castle and remembers that Joshua ran off. She goes looking for her father, Cassius, who does confirm that Joshua was working for Ouroboros, and shortly after he was accepted into the family, Joshua did tell him that if his past life ever came back to haunt him, that he's out. Estelle, upset that 1, she was left out of the loop, and 2, Cassius forbade her from poking around Ouroboros, runs off and takes an airship to Rolent, their hometown. Now, I had said this in first few hours, but she actually spends that first tip of the game just coming to terms with the fact that Josh was gone. She tries to convince herself that maybe he briefly stopped at their home to pick up some stuff, and if she hurries, she can catch him. During her flight, she meets a guy named Kevin, and I'll talk more about him when I talk about the characters, but he agrees to accompany her back to her home, and they get there and Joshua's nowhere to be found. Surprise, surprise. Cassius and Shara had followed them back to the house, and the latter managed to talk Cassius into letting Estelle set out to go find Joshua. So Estelle's gonna go train for a month and then start her new journey. At this point, they play the game's opening movie, and it was glorious, no pun intended. They put Silver Will Golden Wings on full blast, and I was about ready to drag Joshua back home if it killed me. By the way, if you're playing the Evo version, skip the opening. Thank God I had finished the game before I discovered it, cause not only does it have a worse version of the song. What? Put your pitchforks away, that's just my opinion. But Agate, Zin, and Kevin are all absent, which is really weird because the former two are a lot more plot significant here than they were in the first chapter, and you later find out that Kevin, while not that big of a deal in this game, is pretty important to the game's world as a whole. It also spoils a lot of the gut-punching plot twists that happen later as well. I mean, maybe without the context it'll kinda go over your head, but having played the game already and then watching that movie, pretty much everything except the final boss got covered. Also, the two villains who had the least amount of spoilers associated with them were completely absent from the opening, but the one who's actually supposed to be a twist villain and take you by surprise, you know, they show plenty of shots of that person looking all sneaky and suspicious and stuff, so that was really weird. Don't get me wrong, it's still an okay opening, it's just gonna completely wreck you if you're playing the game for the first time and you're going in blind. I mean, like, damn guys, I feel like they made the EVO opening assuming someone already played the original game, but did it ever occur to them that the shiny remake might be someone's first experience with it? Anyway, I definitely prefer the original opening. If you're interested in seeing the EVO opening, just make sure you beat the game before you see it. Alright, you've been warned. After Estelle finishes her training, she goes back to Liberl, and the entire rest of the game takes place in that same country. You spend roughly half of it revisiting the same towns and cities from the first game, and the second half is dedicated to getting Joshua back and saving Liberl. Oh yeah, apparently it's Liberl, not liberal. I said it wrong throughout the entire first chapter review, so I appreciate y'all clearing that up for me. And that's it for the setting. I don't have much to say about the gameplay that hasn't already been said in my first chapter review. It's essentially the same battle system, and the changes that were added were few and far between. The biggest difference is probably the chain attacks. They're special crafts that will allow more than one character to attack in a single turn, so if you need to deal big damage on the spot and your teammates won't be moving for a minute, you can use a chain attack to get everyone to hit the target at once, assuming everyone is in the adequate range and has enough CP to participate. The chain attacks for each character do level up, and this will allow you to rally more party members together. Having two characters using a chain attack might not be that big of a deal, but when you get to the point where you can call in 3 or 4 people to do a chain attack, the damage really does start to add up. All of the characters do keep their S-crafts from the last game, and most of them do learn upgraded versions of these moves in addition to a new one later in the story. The orbment system was modified slightly. There's a new model that's been distributed to all the main characters, so while it does mean that everyone has to relearn all their old spells again, since their current quartz is incompatible with the new model, it does grant everyone an extra slot. Each slot can be leveled up, which will increase the user's max EP and allow them to utilize more powerful quartz that might only be equipable in higher level slots. Both of these new features raise the ceiling for potential spells considerably. You can relearn everything that was available in first chapter, in addition to some new arts that you can get later. Some are more useful than others, but most of the new spells are pretty cool looking and fun to pull off. There were a few that I just never got bored of looking at. Although if your goal is efficiency and conserving EP, the higher level arts don't do that much more damage than their weaker counterparts. I still use them because they were flashier and they made my characters feel more powerful, but you don't really need to. I'd say the only exception would be the ones that do AoE damage, because there's a few that cover the whole screen, so it's actually really convenient being able to pop one of those off and then not having to worry about the enemy running out of range. Now, in the last game, I gave status ailments a lot of praise, but unfortunately they're not really going to help you much here. They'll still work on little guys, but you can't rely on Chaos Brand to carry you through the game this time. Probably because a lot of the major fights in the game are against plot significant characters and not just soldiers or random monsters. I did play SC twice, because I heard stories about a certain pain in the ass during the prologue, and I was like, look, I'm mostly here for the story. I'm not looking to get blasted as early as the prologue and then having to retry the boss like 4 times before I can move on. I'm picking the easiest difficulty. That was a mistake. The beginning felt normal, but after like the end of chapter 1, as the characters started getting stronger, it got to the point where I barely had to think for most bosses. You ever ride a bike and as you start going downhill, you get to a point where you don't have to pedal anymore? You can just sit there and enjoy the wind in your face. Maybe you might stick your legs out and see how goofy you can make yourself look on the way down. You might even press the brake handle just a little bit so you don't go too fast and crash into a tree or something. That's how playing this on easy felt. I was breezing through most everything, and I even held back on a few fights just to make it last longer. Unless I was on the receiving end of someone's S-craft, I barely took damage either. Don't get it twisted, I still had fun, but I really regretted not picking normal. So while most of the gameplay footage you're going to be seeing is from easy mode, I did play the game over again on normal, so I could gauge the true strength of some of these bosses a bit more accurately. Another significant change is your party. Like I said during first few hours, in Sky first chapter, you're pretty much stuck with Estelle, Joshua, and whatever new person came along during that chapter. In second chapter, excluding Joshua, because you're looking for him, everyone else is here. Everyone knows each other, and aside from 1 or 2 mandatory characters you might have to take along, you can fill the rest of the spots with just about anyone else. And it's neat that they actually made unique dialogue for the different party combinations too, because you know how sometimes they give you the freedom to take whoever you want, but in exchange for that, the extra extra characters you bring along can't be too involved in what's going on, well, they decided to make sure that didn't happen in this game. The duplicate scenes make it so that even if you bring someone who has nothing to do with the story at the moment, they'll still comment on what's going on. And if they hadn't done that, I wouldn't even have knocked them for it, since it's a lot of work to implement something like that into the game, but they went the extra mile and did that anyway, even if it would have been a minimal change in most cases, so I really do commend them for that. It actually got to the point where I'd try and anticipate what might happen next and which characters would be most invested in what would happen. Now, that approach did occasionally fall flat on its face at times, but for the most part it paid off. And that's it for the non-spoiler stuff, so from here on out I'll be talking about the story, so if you're sticking around, I'm assuming you either played the game already or you don't mind, so let's get started. Now, I'm going to talk about the main characters, namely how my opinion of them might have changed from the first game to this one. Estelle's definitely the highlight of the game as far as the characters go, because everyone else does develop and get their little moments too, but I feel like she definitely got the best of it. Ever notice how in first chapter Joshua was kind of the brains of the operation? Whenever things got rough, he was usually the one to think things through and figure stuff out, and Estelle was usually just left to tell jokes and do the head bashing? Well, now Joshua's gone, and Estelle has to stand up on her own 2 feet, and whether or not you decide to work with Shara or Agate at the beginning, you're working with them as more of an equal as opposed to the student-like role you had in the first game. Estelle does find herself in a lot more serious situations this time around. She's threatened, she's toyed with, and she ends up interacting with people who have had backgrounds that have turned them inside out. And as she gains more and more perspective on the world around her, you can see her mature, but fortunately, and I appreciate this, it doesn't change her beyond recognition. I have to agree with what Joshua said shortly after he's reunited with Estelle. Despite everything that's going down, she's still the same Estelle. She still has a very Estelle way of doing things, if you know what I mean. Even when she's at the final boss and they're dropping plot twist after plot twist and all the feels are coming in full force and whatnot, she's still criticizing the bad guys in a very tongue-in-cheek fashion. If anything, I feel like her development in this game was to make her more of an adult version of herself instead of attempting to turn her into some kind of brooding anti-hero to match the tone of the story later on. Speaking of brooding anti-heroes, Joshua, let's talk about him. So at the beginning of the game, Joshua does take on a very Sasuke-like role. He abandons his friends to sort his issues out alone. He ends up joining up with some other people, in this case the Kapwa family, and they were some sky bandits who we stopped in the last game, but they managed to slip away during the commotion in Gransel, and Joshua basically helps them get their airship back so he can get a ride to Ouroboros' home base. Now hold on a second, you just said you weren't very fond of edgy-ass characters. Joshua fits that bill pretty well. What's the deal here? Well, one, there's actually a decent in-game reason why he's like that. Remember, Weissman erased most of his memories, so the Joshua you got familiar with in the first game was just a watered-down version of him. The Joshua you're seeing right now is the real one. 2, he doesn't really stay that way. He actually softens up pretty quickly when shit hits the fan, and in a way, I feel like he was kind of his own worst enemy. Everyone else already liked and accepted him, even after learning about his past. He just needed to forgive himself, and by the end of the game, he seemed like a comfortable mix between his sweet and kind FC self and his hardened Ouroboros and early SC self. Remember how I said I wasn't very fond of Agate in the first game? I'm happy to say that this game definitely changed my opinion of him. In first chapter, I thought he was just being a big jerk for the sake of it, but the man had his own inner demons too. You get to learn a lot more about his past and just how badly the 100 Days War messed him up. He actually had a pretty similar story to Estelle and how she lost her mother. His village got caught in the crossfire and he lost his little sister as a result. He and the military haven't really gotten along since then. He's definitely a lot more likable this time around, and I do think it's really cute to see him gradually open up to everyone, especially Tita, who he's basically taken in as a little sister at this point. Speaking of sisters, Shara. She kinda just showed up at the beginning and end of the first chapter, and a lot of her past was implied but not explicitly told. Like, we knew she was somewhat of an older sister to Estelle and she used to be part of the circus. This is Weapons from the Future speaking. I can't believe I left this part out in the script, but there was the fact that she grew up poor and she had to rely on stealing from others to survive, at least until she met the circus troupe and then later Cassius. Can't believe I forgot that. Like everyone else, second chapter does expound on that, though it is worth noting that pretty much all of it is intertwined with one of the game's villains, so it took a few chapters before they actually got into all that, and the juicy bits didn't even drop until near the end of the game. I don't have too much to say about Chloe this time around either. She's still the best support character and best girl, don't get me wrong, but she kinda just tags along this time. She doesn't really do anything too important until near the end of the game, where she officially decides to take her role as princess and heir to the throne seriously. Olivier is still best boy, although Joshua comes in as a close second now too. I still find the guy to be utterly hilarious, and he's half the reason I recommend taking a gate with you to Ruan instead of Shara, because the dialogue between those two is priceless. I did pump him full of fire and earth quartz to make him somewhat of a long-range tank. Whoops. Apparently he's a much better spellcaster than I could have anticipated. Stick as many OP arts on this man as you possibly can. On top of that, the second S-craft you unlock for him late into the story is pure gold.
I call this Requiem for a Doomed Republic. Take that! And there's napalm!
Olivier has his own little twist near the end of the game too, but I'll get into that later. Tita is still Tita, I guess. Her outfit's red, cute you did assume, orbital cannon go boom.
Prepare to meet your doom!
She is there to provide maximum cuteness and AoE cannon damage during the game's darkest moments, so yeah, she keeps on doing that. Zin, like I said before, does get a lot more attention here than he got in the first game. However, as is the case with Shara, the majority of it is tied to one of the game's villains, so I'll actually get more into that when I start talking about them. And finally, we've got Kevin. The man looks like an oddish. Similar to a Gate in the last game, he's kind of in and out of the narrative. He shows up when important stuff happens, and then he leaves almost as quickly as he came. He's a wandering priest who works with the Septian Church, and his job is to travel around and preach to people, specifically the areas that don't have established churches. Or at least that's what he tells you. There is more to his job than just spreading the word of Adios, but we'll get to that later. And that's it for all the main characters. When I discussed the setting, I did talk about the story up until Estelle left to go train. She and another newly appointed senior bracer, Annalise, spend about a month there, and that forms the prologue chapter of the game. When they get back, you're given the option of traveling with either Shara or a Gate. Basically, you'll pick one and you'll spend the next 3 chapters with them, and then you won't join up with the other one until like chapter 4, I believe. Now, from a narrative standpoint, I wouldn't stress too much about who to take along. The plot doesn't really change. Obviously, certain characters are going to react differently depending on whether Shara or a Gate is standing there, but you'll still go to Ruan, no matter who you pick. You'll still meet the same people, you'll fight the same bosses, and Annalise will go to either Bose or Rolent with whoever you didn't pick. Personally, I feel like going with the Gate is preferable. Estelle learning to stand on her own 2 feet is a big part of the game's story, and I feel like going with the Gate definitely takes her out of her comfort zone because unlike Shara, who's basically family to her, she barely knows a Gate. And like I said, once you meet up with Olivier, he and a Gate do have some pretty funny scenes together. As far as gameplay is concerned, if you pick a Gate, he's going to be the only melee-focused character you'll have for a while. Estelle is kind of a mix, she can go either way depending on how you build her, and Olivier and Chloe are both spellcasters. Shara is also kind of a jack of all trades, so if you take her along, you're really going to be lacking someone who can just instantly bring the pain for a chapter or 2. But like I said, it's not that big of a deal. The story is still mostly the same no matter what, I just preferred to take a Gate. Once you get all that sorted out, you quickly learn that finding Joshua actually comes second in their list of priorities. Now that the Bracer Guild and the army know that Ouroboros is working in the shadows, their top priority is sniffing them out and bringing them down. By the way, I guess I haven't really spent a lot of time talking about Ouroboros itself now, have I? Hey you. Yeah, you. Did you like the Akatsuki? Remember Organization 13? Well, you'll be happy to know that Ouroboros has also assembled their own team of supervillains. The Enforcers, elite agents of Ouroboros. Yep, we've got the Joker, Mr. Crocker, Between the Lions, Big Titty Goth GF, Rude with Hair.
Ooh! Looking cool, Joker!
Marluxia's little sister, and her deadliest weapon, the Pater Mater. Actually, it's pronounced Pater Matter. Wait, really? You sure that's not just an English dub thing? Nope, she called it Pater Matter in the Japanese version too. But there's only one T in... whatever, okay fine, roll with it. And lastly, Joshua was one of them too before he met Cassius and Estelle and got his memory wiped. So yes, Weissman wasn't kidding when he said Ouroboros was an entire organization. I actually really like how they did this because only a handful of them bug you in this game, but I'm assuming there's more. At least 15, because that's the highest assigned number I saw in this game. Now generally speaking, I do find going up against a team of villains to be way more fun than just one singular guy, and similar to the heroes, all of the enforcers do have distinct personalities coupled with their own selfish reasons for working under Weissman. I also love how all of them have some type of personal connection with one or more of the main characters. It was kind of funny seeing Blue Blonde and Olivier going back and forth about what beauty truly was, and the former was quite fixated on Chloe. Can't say I blame him. Ow!
Go to horny jail.
Walter and Zin were fellow students who trained under the same master, and then Walter killed the man in a duel one day, and Zin's been trying to figure out what on Adios' left titty that was all about. Renee bamboozled everyone in Gransel and also convinced Amalthea to crawl out of hiding and try and carry out Richard's plan on her own. Up until that point, Tita was pretty happy to have a playmate that was her own age, and Estelle was pretty attached to her too. Even after Renee came out and said, "Yeah, I was lying to you the whole time, I'm kind of a cold-blooded killer," Estelle was still like, "Oh, Renee, stop saying stuff like that, just come off the building." Luciola was basically like a mother to Shara back when they were in the circus, and you remember how Agate and Loe... Did I ever mention Lawrence's real name was Loe, by the way? Yeah, that's a thing apparently. Actually, his real name is Leonhardt. Loe's just his nickname. Oh, come on. Anyway, they were butting heads pretty often in the first game, and that rivalry carries right over into this game as well. He really forces Agate to look deep within himself. Corny. It's true, though. Agate soon realizes that maybe using pure rage to win his fights isn't the best way to go about things. I personally thought it was fine. Just make sure you got someone ready to patch him up after you use that shit. Loe also had a pretty strong connection with Joshua since the two grew up together, and Weissman didn't really tamper with his memories of Loe too much, so that's why Joshua was so fixated on him in the last game. Weissman is technically not an enforcer, though he is in charge of the little squadron you fight in this game. He's actually an Anguis. I assume it's pronounced Anguish, just like anguish, but without the H. But I guess an Anguis is a rank higher than Enforcer. He used to be a bishop at the church before he left and joined Ouroboros, and the end of his tale actually lines right up with Kevin's mission, so I'll get back to him a little later. There's another guy, Campanella the Fool. He doesn't really do much. He keeps saying he's just there to observe what's going on, and true to his word, all he does is watch us struggle. He's like that gym teacher you had back in school who'd drive a golf cart around the track while the rest of y'all were running your legs numb. Anyway, these guys really keep that first half of the game feeling fresh since it kind of follows a villain of the week structure where you visit a new area, something weird's going down, you get to the bottom of it, then you find out it was just an enforcer screwing around, and he or she will usually sick some big boss on you to tide you over until the next big plot point. Each of these incidents that occur during the first half of the game is Ouroboros trying to experiment with the Black Orbment and draw out the true capabilities of their machines. Oh, by the way, those Black Orbments are properly known as Gospels. And yes, Ouroboros does have a whole bunch of them by now. Estelle and company first catch wind of this plan in Rouen, where Blue Blonde is using his gospel to enhance a holographic projector, which casts an exact copy of his own image across the city. This leads the citizens to believe that there's a ghost running around, and then they go to Zeiss, where Walter has been using his gospel to play around with the septum veins and cause massive earthquakes in specific parts of the city. And then there was Gransel, where Renee tried to stir up commotion to cripple the negotiations between Liberl, Erebonia, and the Calvert Republic. She even loaned Amalthea her gospel so that she could power her tank and storm the Queen's castle. Now Kevin did manage to break her gospel, and thankfully Estelle and the gang did come out of that fight victorious. On a side note, it was also neat getting to play as Julia for a bit. After all that, Kevin reveals that he's more than just some wandering priest. He's a member of the Gralsritter, or Grail Knights, who are basically high-ranking members of the church who are currently supposed to be collecting ancient artifacts. Now, these artifacts are special tools of old that are so powerful that the church has to make sure that average Joe Schmoes don't find them, and then use their powers for their own selfish reasons. Kevin already found one, which is how he managed to break Amalthea's gospel a while ago. Additionally, like the Bracers, he's also trying to track down Ouroboros. Remember the shining ring I mentioned in the first chapter video? Its proper name is the Areole, and Richard, undoing the seal beneath the castle, activated the 4 towers around the country, which serves as a second barrier to reaching it. Now at this point, the church still isn't too sure what Ouroboros wants to do with the Areole, but they sent Kevin out there to see what's going on. So yeah, traveling around and preaching, that's just his part-time job. Kevin's a lot more important than he was letting on, and that's not even the biggest twist about him. The group then heads to Rolent, where Lucius Luciola is using her gospel to cover the town in a thick fog and send its residents into comas. It's here that everyone learns that Luciola and Shara used to be close long ago, but then the circus ringleader, Mr. Harvey, died shortly afterwards and the group disbanded. Obviously, as time went on, Shara eventually met Cassius and joined the Bracer Guild, while Luciola went and joined Ouroboros. Finally, the group heads over to Bose, where Weissman and Loe use the gospel to brainwash an ancient dragon called Ragnard and terrorize the city. The dragon ends up setting a gate's old village ablaze, which understandably has the man pretty pissed. Loe takes the dragon into a cave to readjust his control over it, but a gate follows him in and a fight ensues. This was actually one of my favorite scenes in the entire game. You had Loe egging on a gate and exploiting his short temper, and with the way a gate was just freaking out during the whole thing, you had this crawling realization that he was hiding something big. You had this epic looking duel going on, and you had the Silver Will cherry on top to boot. Loe eventually overpowers a gate, but Tita rushes in and tells Loe that he can't have a gate unless he goes through her. She then admits that she loves him. Aww. It was actually quite the tearjerker. Before the situation can get any bloodier than it already is, the military arrives and Loe takes Ragnard and retreats. This is when everyone learns about a gate's past and how he lost his sister during the war. It doesn't take long for a gate to recover and rejoin the party. The military has a plan to subdue Ragnard, but when that fails, the general does allow the bracers to head in and break the dragon free of the gospel's control. After that, the group decides to take a day off and plan their next move, including Kevin, who's conveniently shown up again. Kevin does mention the towers serving as a second barrier to the Areole, and their vacation is actually cut short when Kurt, the same bracer in charge of Estelle's training at the beginning of the game, shows up that evening pretty badly wounded. He tells everyone that his team of 4 managed to find and infiltrate Ouroboros' base, but only he managed to make it out. The other 3 have been captured. So now that Estelle and company know the location of the base, they decide to head over there and save the missing bracers. You have to take Estelle and Kevin, but you can fill the remaining spots with whoever you want. Just make sure that if you have anything useful on Olivier that you take it off of him, since he's going to leave your party in a little bit, and he's going to take all of his equipped quartz with him. The group takes a boat to Ouroboros' base, and they manage to save all the captured bracers. They make it to one room in particular, and Estelle thinks she finally found Joshua, only to realize that it was a puppet that looked like him. And it was at this point that I really just started to realize how much of a terrible person Weissman really was. Like, yeah, after that big reveal at the end of the first game, you knew that he was evil, but this scene right here really just shows you how low he was willing to kick. Like, you know the girl is out here flipping the country upside down looking for her boyfriend, and then you put a fake Joshua inside of the base. Then you make her fight him. Like, no wonder Loe isn't fond of you. Y'all might be on the same side, but you two implement very different tactics when it comes to reaching your goals. Anyway, after that shock to everyone's system, Weissman himself shows up, though no one can see his face due to the shadows in the room, alongside Renee and Loe. They put everyone to sleep and kidnap Estelle. Now Estelle wakes up after a rather depressing dream, and she finds herself aboard Ouroboros' brand spanking new airship, the Glorious. So Renee comes in and guides her to where Weissman is. Of course he's playing an organ when she comes in. Dear God, it's like the most villainous thing a villain could ever villain. He could have just made himself a little less obvious, but yeah, this scene is a pretty big deal, because it's the first time Estelle is actually meeting Weissman in this game. Up until this point, she only knew him as Alba. She actually handles the meeting quite well. I thought for sure she'd be like, oh my God, Alba, you were behind this whole thing. Like, I'm so shocked. But it's more like, yeah, I've got some questions for you. Please stop playing that organ. It's driving me nuts. You gotta love Estelle. Like, her first question isn't even, where's Joshua? It's, are you actually a poor archaeologist? And he's all like, no, I'm a rich archaeologist. How do you think I managed to afford this ark that's bigger than your hometown? We've got enough ice cream to fill your whole house. You'll have to excuse me. I'm craving ice cream as I'm recording this. Weissman also tells her that he used to be a priest for the Septian Church before meeting some dude called the Grandmaster and joining Ouroboros. Estelle asks him, what is the Areole? It's Oriole, you uncultured swine. Wait, for real? Well, screw it, I'm not going back and re-recording that. Anyway, Estelle asks him what is the Oriole and why does he want it, and of course he's like, I can't answer that, you'll have to wait and see. We're only like 25 hours into this game. He does confirm that Joshua is alive and well, which the audience already knows because they got to play as him for a hot minute during Chapter 4, but it's the first time Estelle is getting an update like this. Weissman also tells Estelle about the conversation he and Joshua had at the end of the first game, the one that caused them to run away from home. And of course he did try and paint it as if Joshua was the selfish prick when he ran away from his friends and family out of concern for them. Estelle, now aware of the fact that Weissman not only finessed her new boyfriend but ruined her first kiss, tries to get a hit in, but Loe blocks it. The rest of the enforcers show up. Actually, they were there the whole time, we just didn't have Joshua's ninja skills to let us know this time. Weissman asks Estelle if she'd like to join Ouroboros. Yeah, I couldn't really believe it myself. He explains that if she joined, Joshua would most likely come back to them. She's given some time to think about it while the rest of the enforcers head out to do evil villain stuff, I guess. They left Loe behind to look after Estelle, and he takes this opportunity to explain what really happened to his and Joshua's hometown, Hamel. Now, Hamel was located in Erebonia. Loe lived there with Joshua and his older sister, and the three of them were friends. One day, a bunch of invaders with Liberalian weapons came in. To call the incident a massacre is putting it lightly. Think of it this way. Liberalian invaders, Anakin. Hamel, Sand People. No one was safe. Not the women, not the children. It's also heavily implied that the soldiers did a lot more than kill the women too, if you're picking up what I'm putting down. Loe, Joshua's sister, and Joshua himself tried to run away, but long story short, his sister Karen ends up getting killed trying to protect Joshua. Joshua shoots the attacker with his own gun, and by the time Loe catches up, Karen's basically on death's door and entrusts her harmonica to Joshua. That's why he's so attached to the thing, and it does make that final scene in the first chapter that much more impactful because it means Joshua trusted Estelle enough to leave his sister's harmonica with her. Of course, once Erebonia heard about this, they were not happy. If you're wondering what triggered the 100 Days War, it was that. They started blasting up Liberl almost immediately, and like I said in the first chapter review, Liberl didn't really get their shit together until Cassius entered the fray. But then Loe said the story was changed after the war. They said it was just a band of Jaegers, and then they said no one was to speak of the Hamel incident again, and that it was a landslide that's what took out the village. As you could probably guess, the whole thing was fabricated. There were some bigwigs in the Empire who wanted an excuse to invade Liberl, so they sent some thugs down there dressed as Liberalian soldiers to go and cause trouble. Then when the rest of Erebonia realized their mistake, they freaked out and killed those guys that were responsible, and then they were all like, well, the landslide did it, trying to cover up the evidence. This was what broke Joshua's heart to the point where the kid couldn't even function anymore. I mean, shit, when I was 6, my biggest worry was eating all my vegetables and finishing my homework in time for the next episode of Power Rangers. By the time this guy was 6, his parents were dead, he watched his sister die, he watched his village burn down, he killed a man, and then people now gotta pretend that none of that happened. My boy Joshua has seen some shit. Weissman found the two of them and agreed to take care of Joshua while Loe began training as one of their agents. As soon as Joshua got better, he followed the same path. After hearing all of that, Estelle now knows for sure that she doesn't want to join Ouroboros. She says she'll never be able to truly pull Joshua back from the Gulf if she sticks around with them, and honestly, she took all that quite well. Me, on the other hand, I had to get up from my computer, drink some water, rethink my life for a bit. Loe tells her not to try escaping, so you know exactly what's going to happen next. On her way out, she runs into a few of Ouroboros' Jaegers, one of which being Gilbert. He was in the first game, worked under the mayor in Rouen, and was also involved in the scandal that happened in Chapter 2 of that game. Apparently, after they got busted, he joined Ouroboros. I don't really have much else to say about him, the guy's kind of a joke. Estelle still ends up struggling due to the fight being 5 against 1. Joshua shows up in a Jaeger disguise and finishes off the rest of them. Loe tries to stop them, but Joshua went and fiddled with the Glorious's engine, which forces Loe to go down there and fix it, and gives them a chance to escape. Estelle and Joshua head to the hangar and they take an airship out of there. They end up crash landing on a nearby beach, and Estelle, thankfully, convinces Joshua to stick around. This was actually a pleasant surprise. Finding Joshua was one of the main goals presented to you from the get-go, and I didn't expect to see him back until closer to the final boss. I truly thought it would have taken the entire game to get him back, maybe they would have just been dangling him, saying like, hey, you gotta get Joshua back, keep going, you gotta get Joshua back, I'm glad he returned at a little over the halfway point though, because it really allows the Oriole to take center stage for the rest of the game. Speaking of Oriole, Ouroboros is ready to put their plan into action. Blue Blonde stations himself at the Esmelis Tower in Relent, Walter at the Carnelia Tower in Zeiss, Luciola at the Safril Tower in Rouen, and Renee at the Ambril Tower in Beauzé. Each of them have planted a gospel device at the top, and Weissman, possessing a 5th gospel, activates his in the sky. This causes an ominous-looking aura to engulf the towers, so Kevin was right. The towers do serve as a second barrier to reaching the Oriole. And what's really cool is that these towers were in the first game and you were free to explore them for treasure and whatnot, but you probably had no idea idea they were this important to the plot. These two games really do take their time letting the plot unfold, but once it did, the payoff was really good. Joshua catches the queen up on everything he gleaned while he was away, and the general puts the army on high alert for the time being. Oh, by the way, Joshua really isn't in any trouble for what he did in the past. Considering LeBurl was also in the wrong for helping to cover the Hamel incident up, they let him go free. Everyone's pretty happy to see Joshua again, but they don't really get a lot of time to celebrate. Ouroboros is coming in hot, and they've got soldiers and archaisms, which I'm pretty sure are just what they call robots, attacking all 5 major cities. On top of that, everyone is now aware that the towers have changed and there's an enforcer planted at each of them, so the group plans to hit up each of the 4 towers, excluding Olivier, who has to go back to Erebonia for his own business. You trek through each of the newly renovated towers, and once you get to the top, you fight whichever enforcer was waiting for you there. This is actually the first time you get to fight them personally. I don't really have too much to say about the enforcer boss fights. The music's pretty damn good. They'll summon a couple mooks to assist them, and you'd best beware of their S-crafts, but outside of that, they're pretty manageable. Make sure you bring some anti-confuse and anti-sleep stuff for Luciola, and have plenty of just anti-status stuff in general for Renee. That Gorgon laser don't play around. The only other noteworthy things revealed was Walter stating that there was more to the deathmatch than he was letting on, Luciola admitting that she was the one who killed Mr. Harvey, and Estelle trying once more to carry out Operation Cuddle with Renee. Fighting the enforcers didn't really mean much though. After some time, each tower returns to normal and a giant structure appears in the sky, shutting down all orbital devices across the continent. Thankfully, Professor Russell managed to develop zero-field generators to negate this effect. Unfortunately, the devices have a limited radius. He made one for the airship, a few for some of the military bases, one in Grand Sol, and you have to go install the remaining ones at the 4 remaining cities, Bozet, Rolent, Rouen, and Zeiss. I found this to be the most boring chapter in the game. It's the first time the game actually opens up the entire map for you to explore, but you have to walk across all of it on foot. As an added kick in the balls, the shutdown means the orbments don't work, so no casting arts for you. There are some side quests in most of the towns as well. If you get to a guild branch and they say, hey, it'd be really cool if you checked out over there, just know that actually taking their advice and going over there will probably initiate a hidden side quest. If you're feeling lazy, I guess you don't have to do them, but it's still a pretty good way to see how people are holding up during the Orbital shutdown. I'd recommend at least going to the Academy. That one was definitely the most interesting in my opinion. You get both Kurt and Annalise as playable characters for that little situation, and you even get a visit from Campanella too. While everyone's busy trying to get communication between the branches up and running, Ouroboros and the Enforcers storm Grand Sol. They steamroll the army and make a beeline for the Queen's castle. You know things are bad when Duke Doonan of all people decides to step up to the plate and actually do something. The Enforcers manage to grab hold of the Queen and Chloe, who had returned to the castle shortly after the shutdown. And just when it's looking real bleak for everyone, Dick Richards shows up along with the former intelligence division, and they manage to tip the scales back in our favor. I guess they were feeling pretty desperate if they went and busted them out of jail. Unfortunately, the whole attack on Grand Sol was just to buy time. Erebonia's got steam-powered tanks and they're pulling up to LeBurl's border as we speak. Apparently, they think that that giant floating city that showed up out of nowhere and shut down all their orbital devices was LeBurl's doing. They say that they just want to pull up to the border and assist with any hardships LeBurl might encounter, but it doesn't take a detective to figure out how dangerous of an idea that is. Remember in the first chapter video I said LeBurl's army was only a fraction of the size of Erebonia's. Erebonia could easily overpower them if they wanted to, and the fact that they had a secret stash of steam tanks, which while inefficient didn't use orbital energy so they were perfect for the situation, makes their actions all the more suspicious. Chloe, who's made the decision to officially take up her role as princess, decides to represent LeBurl in the negotiations. Not long afterward, the Prince of Erebonia makes his grand entrance.
Wait, what?
Yep. Olivier's real name is Oliver, the Prince of Erebonia. To make a long story short, because the video's already becoming quite lengthy, they managed to convince the Erebonian general to hold off on taking action. They're like, look, just give us a day or two and we'll get this mess sorted out. Cassie is showing up with the royal airship being all like, hey guys, look, our airship still flies even though everything's shut down, only reinforces our claim of being able to investigate the floating city and stop the orbital shutdown. So the group heads up on the airship and ends up crash landing on the floating city, courtesy of Loe. This is the final area of the game and it's massive. You can explore the entire airship. There's like 3 or 4 big areas and they're all connected by a few underground passageways. The last area also has a giant tower for you to climb on your way to the final boss. It's kinda weird to be honest, the place is really quiet and relaxing, which stands in stark contrast to the final dungeon in the first chapter. Cause in first chapter you had robots everywhere along with this epic dungeon music blasting in the background, but here, even though the stakes are way higher, it's all tranquil and stuff. It kinda seems like it'd make for a nice vacation spot. The place is called Liber Arc, and a long time ago there was an entire civilization up here. The place was powered and run by the Oriole, which is one of the Septarians. 7 ancient treasures, I'm assuming one for each element in the game, as the Oriole is the Septarian of space. Anyway, the Oriole was powering the whole city, and for a while things were pretty good. Everyone had a gospel, which is what they'd use to dial up the Oriole if they needed something, and the Oriole, no joke, could just give them whatever they wanted. From giving them basic stuff like food and clothing to dumping them in an alternate reality that caters to all their desires. Obviously, having a magical battery that can just give an entire city what it wants whenever it wants is going to make everyone pretty lazy and self-centered over time. People got shittier and shittier as a result, until one day Chloe's great to the power of 20 grandmother was all like, alright, enough's enough. She and a bunch of other people started working against the Oriole and managed to get it sealed away, and they developed the underground dungeon in the 4 towers as sort of a 2-layered barrier to keep people from accidentally summoning the city again. Of course, with nowhere else to go, they headed back down to Earth and established a new civilization down there, and Chloe's ancestor became its first queen. This is how Liberl was formed, you know, Liber Arc, Liberl. See the connection? You can read up about it if you collected all the data entries back at the towers, but even if you didn't, Weissman explains most of it at the end of the game anyway, so either way you're good. The last district has a giant tower at the end. Weissman and the enforcers are chilling over there. You basically gotta plow through each of the enforcers, and then Weissman himself is the final boss. Now, like I said earlier, dialogue does change depending on who's in your party. You get a little break to go back and restock every time you beat an enforcer, so make sure you bring the party members who have the most beef with their respective enforcer. So that'd be Olivier and Chloe for Blue Blonde, Zin for Walter, Shara for Luciola. Well, for Renee, Estelle is in your party by default, and I brought Tita as well. And you can bring pretty much whoever you want for Loe, because Joshua's in there by default. But just be warned that whoever you fight Loe with is also who you'll be taking to the final boss. I wish I had known about this earlier. I would not have taken Weller with me to the Loe fight, because then we get to Weissman and Weller barely has anything to do with Weissman, so, you know, when all this stuff is happening, he's just like, yeah, oh, cool story, bruh. After I beat the game, I did the final boss over, but with a Gate and Shara instead, since they were the 2 characters who split up to go do their own things at the start, and I thought it'd be pretty cool to have them come back together for the finale, so I think that makes 3 times I fought the final boss. First time was blind, second time I switched it up so that a Gate and Shara were in the party, and then third time was when I actually played it on normal mode. Anyway, the boss fights against the enforcers themselves aren't too bad. If you could handle them at the towers, you can probably handle them here. The only big difference is being the fact that Renee fights with I almost called it Pater Mater again. That Renee fights with Patter Matter instead of her pint-sized mini-bots, and then you'll have to fight Loe this time too, since before he was tending to the Glorious. The Loe fight was actually pretty hard. Even on easy mode, he still handed me my ass. The final boss felt easier than he did. Anyway, after you beat him, he and Joshua have a one-on-one duel, and Joshua manages to disarm him, after which Loe deems him the victor. Then his opinion on humanity just miraculously turns around. He's good now. Went from Loe to Broe real quick. And it was kinda sudden, but I was glad. He's already a pretty cool character, but just knowing that I wasn't going to be on the receiving end of that sword anymore made him even cooler all of a sudden. That little fight we had in the first game still gives me PTSD. Before we can get used to his company, however, Weissman shows up and blasts the shit out of him. Then he brainwashes Joshua, and then they head deep into the tower to go get the Oriole. Like I said, whatever party you fought Loe with is who you're taking to go find Weissman. It doesn't take long for your group to find Weissman, and this is where he explains what the Oriole did for the Liber Arc and how it was eventually sealed away for everyone's own good. Joshua, having anticipated before that Weissman would try and brainwash him, managed to weaken Weissman's hold on him with the help of Cassius prior to them landing on the floating city. So boom, Joshua's back. Weissman fuses with the Oriole and turns into this ugly looking angel thing. At first no one can hit it, but hey, Loe's back, and he's dead. Okay, seriously Falcom, what the hell? I was looking forward to playing as him. Maybe you saw his death as him paying for all the people he did kill while he was with Ouroboros. But did you have to do it as soon as he turned good? You couldn't have waited a couple games? Like, nice Loe is best Loe, am I right? Anyway, before he died, he did manage to get some important information out of Weissman. Loe was all like, hey Weissman, how involved were you with the destruction of Hamel? And Weissman was like, I might have given them a little nudge, you know, giving the Jaegers a bit of a shout out. Basically his little euphemism for, yeah, I totally had my grubby little mitts and all that.
That crawling little cockroach.
And it was at that point that I lost all sympathy for Weissman. You got an entire village wiped off the face of the continent, you took the only 2 survivors and turned them into cold-blooded killers, you're ultimately responsible for the 100 Days War and everyone who died during it, Estelle's mom, Agate's sister, and many other people the game didn't even bother mentioning. You just killed off Loe. At this point I was like, end him. Give him the most brutal Final Fantasy drama death you can think of. Now, Loe's sword is actually a pretty special sword given to him by the Grandmaster himself, so he actually managed to weaken Angel Weissman just enough for us to deal damage. So this is where the final boss begins, along with the trippiest final boss theme I've ever heard in a video game. I guess I spoke too soon on the lack of god killing in Trails, huh? I guess like with everything else in these 2 games, they were just taking their time with the build-up. Weissman's got 2 phases. The first is pretty straightforward. During the second, he'll keep switching up his elemental resistances throughout the fight, which honestly helps you more than it helps him, because every time he becomes resistant to something, he becomes weaker to the opposite. So if he puts up a fire barrier, use water. If he puts up earth, use wind, etc. If you got past Loe, you'll probably get past Weissman without that much of a hitch. He's really not that bad. He just has a ridiculous amount of HP for you guys to burn through. Once you give Weissman a well-deserved beatdown, everyone goes to see Loe, who gives your party one last farewell and asks Estelle to keep taking care of Joshua. Man, of course we will. Joshua's second best boy. What do you think this is? Anyway, they got bigger problems at the moment. Beating the shit out of Weissman separated him from the Oriole, and it vanished almost immediately afterwards. Remember, the Oriole was what was powering the city, so if we don't head out, it's gonna collapse with us on it. There are a few complications along the way, but Estelle, Joshua, and the gang managed to make it out of the city unharmed. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on who you're rooting for at the moment, Weissman wasn't so lucky. As he's making his way out of the tower, he runs into Kevin. Oh yeah, you forgot about Kevin, didn't you? Thought he was just some wisecracking priest, huh? Nah, Kevin was a man on a mission. The church already wasn't very fond of Weissman dipping and joining one of their greatest enemies. Yes, Kevin is a wandering priest. Yes, he is a member of the Graal's Ritter. Yes, he is supposed to be running around and collecting the artifacts to keep the peace. Apparently, the dude is also the church's hitman. And Weissman snagging the Oriole and basically turning into a god with plans to rewrite an entire nation put him at the top of their shit list. Kevin shoots Weissman, and at first Weissman is a bit underwhelmed, thinking that Kevin really is planning to try and kill him with just his crossbow. That is until he looks down and realizes that Kevin didn't shoot him with an arrow, he shot him with a stake, causing Weissman to turn into a pillar of salt. I guess you could say that situation had him feeling a bit salty. Get it? Because he was probably bitter about losing the Oriole, and then Kevin literally turned him into salt? Anyone? Anyone? I'm flagging this video for bad puns. After that, Estelle and Joshua plant Loe's sword next to Karen's grave so the 2 of them can rest in peace together. Estelle intends to keep her promise to help Joshua fit back into society, which basically means that they'll be continuing their careers as bracers for the foreseeable future. And that's where the game ends. Loved every second of it. Like I said, first chapter and second chapter were kind of 2 halves of one game, with first chapter kind of setting up the characters and setting, and then second chapter actually advancing the main plot. Now, even though second chapter does conclude Estelle and Joshua's story, I am aware that there's a third Sky game that kind of wraps up the Libero arc in a nice little bow and sets up a few things for the next arc, so stay tuned for that because I do have that one installed and ready to go. I've kind of caught on to this whole, Trails thing now. Always buy the next one before you finish the one you're on, so you don't have to wait. But for now, that marks the end of the video. Feel free to leave a like if you enjoyed it, subscribe to the channel if you want to hear me rattle on about JRPGs or other Japanese games I happen to come across, and I will see you all again very soon. Hey, did you know that when you abbreviate Trails in the Sky, it actually spells tits? Yeah, there's your fun fact of the day.